Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council program with guest speaker, Dr. Madhav Joshi. Thanks to Dr. Joshi and to everyone who has joined us online today. I'm Bill Reisinger, ICFRC board member and program committee chair, and I'll be hosting today's program. We have special program sponsors today, Karen and Wally Chappell, both longtime leaders, friends, and sponsors of ICFRC. So we thank them both for their great support. We would also like to acknowledge and thank our other annual donors and sponsors for their support. Midwest One Bank, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and international programs. The Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization, the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa, and City Channel 4 for its support in live streaming our in-person programs and for providing access to all of ICFRC's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are located. Please keep your audio and video turned off during the duration of the presentation, so you do not interrupt the speaker during his remarks. Following our speaker's presentation, at about 12:45, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Madhav Joshi, who will speak about the Intra-Afghan peace process, the Taliban victory, and women's rights. Madhav Joshi is research professor and associate director of the Peace Accords Matrix, PAM, at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He oversees the data coding on the implementation of peace agreements worldwide for the PAM project and leads the research initiatives on peace agreement design, implementation, and post-implementation political and economic developments. Dr. Joshi earned his PhD in comparative politics and research methodology from the University of North Texas in 2010. His research and teaching focus is on civil wars, mediation, post-Civil War democratization, democratic survival, peace duration, and peace building. He has published on these topics in top political science and international relations journals. He has also facilitated ongoing peace processes by authoring or co-authoring over 70 policy briefs for government officials in the Philippines, Norway, Nepal, and Colombia, as well as the United Nations Development Program and many civil society organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshi.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Iowa City Foreign Relations Council for this invitation. And that's a lot of, accolade, Bill, that you read. but so today, I would like to talk about the Intra-Afghan, peace process related issues. But just a quick disclaimer that I'm not a specialist of Afghan politics. And my research, as Bill was saying, broadly focused on comparative peace processes, how civil war peace agreements are reached and how they are implemented following the signing of the agreement. So I happen to research the case of Afghanistan in context of my peace process research work, and I use some comparative insights from other peace processes, in other countries to understand, what's going on in terms of the Afghan peace process. So I also would like to acknowledge the sufferings of innocent Afghan civilians, the women and girls who are going through the humanitarian disaster and uncertain future. And this is also the reason why it is important to find the solution to the endless cycle of violence in Afghanistan. And just a quick definition, when I talk about, when I say the peace process, I'm usually referring to the talks between the armed actors who are challenging the legitimacy of the government in one way or another, and there are talks in finding negotiated solutions to end the conflict, civil wars. So in today's presentation, I will focus on three big issues. First, I'll focus on some of the empirical patterns related to intra-state armed conflict and peace agreement. Second, the relationship between conflict, the types of conflict termination and peace. And third, I think, after talking about these two specific issues very quickly, that will put us in a good situation, good position to talk about the intra-Afghan peace process. And when I talk about the intra-Afghan peace process, I will focus on the lead up to the Doha agreement, the intra-Afghan negotiation, followed by following the Doha agreement, the intra-Afghan negotiation itself in Doha, and the Taliban victory and what it means for the women's rights in Afghanistan, and whether the peace process is the only path forward for peace and stability in Afghanistan. So just let's get quickly, around this particular graph. It summarizes or provides an overview of civil war and peace agreement for the last 75 years, since 1946 up to 2020. As you can see in this graph, the peace negotiation, especially in context of civil war, was not a common practice during the Cold War period, and it is very important to note that. But with the end of the Cold War, or you even can say with the increasing involvement of the United Nations in peacemaking and peacebuilding since early 1990s, you can see a lot of peace agreement being negotiated in intra-state armed conflict, which is denoted by the red line in this particular graph. And as a result of a lot of international focus and international involvement, there was a lot of peace agreements negotiated, and that contributed to the decline of intra-state armed conflict. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the termination data that they have compiled, it suggests that out of 96 conflict terminated between 1946 and 1988, that is during the Cold War period, 79 conflicts were terminated in one-sided victory, and 17 conflicts were terminated in negotiated peace agreement. So this trend was reversed in the post-Cold War period. Data suggests that between 1989 and 2014, 44 conflicts were terminated in one-sided victory, and 73 conflicts were terminated in either ceasefire or peace agreement. In other words, the frequency of conflict termination reversed. There was 329% increase in negotiated settlement compared to 44% decline in one-sided victory just between the Cold War and post-Cold War period. The graph also shows that there are more active armed conflicts these days than ever before, actually. And this trend actually started after 2011 Arab Spring in Middle East and North African countries. And after 2011, there is not a lot of peace agreements negotiated. And there can be, my comparative understanding of what's going on in peacemaking and peacebuilding is that there can be three reasons to explain this particular phenomena in the last 10 years and so. The first one is the increase in the number of armed conflicts with religious dimension. The second one is the lack of international mediators focusing on how to engage religious issues or religious actors in peace negotiation. And third, too much involvement of international actors in socio-political and economic re-engineering of the post-conflict state without engaging the key actors, key domestic actors who are influential in domestic politics. And certainly all these three elements are present in case of Afghanistan. So here I present some empirical patterns related to types of conflict termination and post-conflict peace. Conflict can terminate either in government victory, rebel victory, comprehensive peace agreement, partial peace agreement, or just the parties just can stop fighting altogether. But a peace agreement is comprehensive if negotiation process involves all relevant armed actors and all contentious issues are on the negotiation table. And one interesting thing is that the armed groups can, armed conflict can reemerge following any types of termination. Um, but the comprehensive settlements, that type of particular settlement seems successfully avoiding the relapse into conflict after the comprehensive agreement if they are successfully implemented. If we look the sample of only comprehensive peace agreements since 1989, the success rate is over 84% or over 84% of the countries that negotiated comprehensive peace agreement, they did not have any kind of armed conflict. And certainly the objectives of intra-Afghan negotiation in Afghanistan after the Doha peace agreement was to find comprehensive solution, comprehensive settlement to all types of conflict in Afghanistan. But obviously there was, as we all know, there was a rebel victory or Taliban victory in Afghanistan in August this year. And compared to comprehensive settlement, as you can see in this particular graph, the rebel victories are more likely to lead to more armed conflict. So the current situation in Afghanistan is not so easy for both for the Taliban and also for the international actors. And for almost 50 years in Afghanistan, there is a lot of political instability and armed conflict, and it comes in all sizes and forms of major regional and international involvement. A few peace agreements were signed in Afghanistan, but those peace agreements were not very inclusive. For example, the Peshawar Accord in 1992, it was signed after the Soviet withdrawal, dealing with the situation in Afghanistan at that time and the formation of new Afghan government. But the accord was not signed by all Afghan Mujahideen parties who were involved in the conflict at that time. After the US overthrow of Taliban in 2001, there was a Bonn Declaration and in 2004 there was a Berlin Declaration, and this declaration included factions in the Northern Alliance, the United States and other third-party actors, but the Taliban were not part of these declarations. They were not consulted. They were not part of the negotiation process. After 2001 terrorist attack in the United States, the Taliban were asking to have a dialogue with the United States, but all those requests we know that rejected by the United States. The focus of the United States after a terrorist attack in the United States, was in Afghanistan was to fight terrorism, and after a few years, the focus shifted to counterinsurgency, fighting counterinsurgency. There became the major military objective. The counterinsurgency fight in Afghanistan, however, we all know that they lacked political strategy, and that contributed to the regrouping and rearmament of the Taliban. And there is plenty of research done on this particular issue. So because of the protracted counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan, the US military and political leaders, they came to realize that the only way to end war in Afghanistan is through negotiation with the Taliban, and it happened around 2010. So that led to the meeting of the US officials and Taliban representatives in Geneva, in Germany in 2010. And following this, over half a dozen talks took place in Doha over the course of several months. But the Doha negotiation stalled in January 2012 for disagreement between the US Congress and the Taliban on the release of Guantanamo Bay prisoners. So the Taliban were actually demanding, them to be free in Afghanistan, but the US proposal was to move them to some other prison in other countries. The talks officially ended in 2013. After a year and a half, the Afghan government announced that they are willing, they would hold talks with Taliban. And the first rounds of talks started in Pakistan in 2015. And the talks was, in the talk, there was representation of the United States and China and other regional powers. But the momentum stalled after the death of Taliban leader Mullah Omar and the Taliban second in command at that time was in a prison in Pakistan, and the Pakistani government did not release him to continue with the negotiation process. So negotiation basically collapsed after the first round of talk. In January 2017, the Taliban offered peace talk with the new US administration. The new US administration was in the position of not to talk with the hardline Afghan Taliban. They were contemplating the ideas of negotiating with the moderate Taliban factions, but ultimately, the U.S. government appointed a special envoy to negotiate with the Taliban. So, there was no barriers to who can be included from the Taliban side. And between September 2018 and September 2019, the U.S. had at least 8 rounds of talks with the Taliban, but the talks suspended for a few months after Taliban fighter killed US soldier in October 2019, but talks resumed again in December 2019. So on February 2021, on February 21, 2020, the US coalition forces, the Afghan government and Taliban agreed for a week-long reduction in violence as a prelude to the Doha peace agreement, which was signed between the Taliban and the United States government on 29 February 2020. The Doha agreement has 3 core elements. First, it provided a roadmap for the withdrawal of the US and NATO troops from Afghanistan after almost 2 decades of relentless fighting. Second, it seeks a guarantee from the Taliban that it would not allow its member, other individuals, or groups to use Afghan soil to threaten the United States and its allies. And third, it has a provision of the exchange of prisoners between the Afghan government and Taliban to pave the way for intra-Afghan negotiations. And there are also other elements, including the United States supporting the reconstruction of Afghanistan after the successful peace process. So here is a quick, I did a little bit of research on to what extent the Doha Agreement was implemented or not implemented last April or March, I say. And here is a key findings, in terms of the implementation of the Doha Agreement. The part 1, which mostly contains commitments on part of the United States, is mostly implemented. The only thing that was not implemented in this particular part relates to the US administration review of sanctions against the Taliban. So that part, is not implemented. Part 2 mostly deals with the Taliban commitment, and commitments in these parts, has the lowest implementation rate. But it is also difficult to probe the measures, taken by the Taliban towards implementing those commitments, because there is no way to probe that to the extent that I would like to probe. And part 3, the specific commitments includes the US commitment of providing economic reconstruction, and also some of the measures taken by the United Nations Security Council resolution there. But the key thing that we all need to understand is that the Doha peace agreement is not a typical peace agreement. It had a number of complexities from comparative peace process point of view. First, the agreement was signed between a non-state actor, the Taliban, and a third-party state, the United States. The Afghan government was not a signatory of the agreement. Second, the signatories of the agreement expected compliance from multiple other actors, including the Afghan state and the United Nations Security Council. But they were not, as I said, they were not part of the agreement. The another complexity was that the agreement's implementation was the basis for the intra-Afghan negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And third, there was no deadline for the agreement's implementation, but there was a deadline for the US and NATO troops withdrawal, which created a lot of complexities. In other peace processes, for example, in Angola in 1991, the foreign troops were withdrawn only after the parties reached a comprehensive ceasefire. And we all know that in Bosnia in 1995, the NATO troops stayed there to implement the 95 peace agreement. Here, the troops withdrawal date is set forth before the Afghan government and the Taliban actually reached a final agreement. I would say that the Doha agreement partially worked. The Taliban did not attack the United States and NATO troops, but the conflict continued between the Taliban and the Afghan state. But because of the continuation of the violence between Afghanistan, Afghan government and the Taliban, it created a lot of complication in terms of implementing the provisions related to the release of prisoners. So as part of the agreement, the Taliban are required to release 1,000 Afghan prisoners, and the Afghan government was required to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners as part of building trust and starting the intra-Afghan negotiation. I collected data on who is releasing the prisoners on what date, and it took almost 5 months for both sides, especially the Afghan government, to release all the prisoners as required in the Doha agreement. So the early momentum, in a peacebuilding, peacemaking, we talk about the momentum that is being created after the signing, so the early momentum that was very critical to push the Doha negotiation process, the intra-Afghan negotiation in Doha, was actually lost because there was a lot of back and forth on release of the prisoners. And it also created a lot of trust issues on part of the, whether the United States can actually have a leverage on Taliban or even Afghan government. So we collected data on, after the Doha agreement was signed, collected data on who is meeting with whom, after the Doha agreement was signed, the Afghan side and then Taliban side, they nominated their negotiating team, and only the Afghan government had women's representation in their negotiating team. So when in our data, what was found was that in the first phase, and these are just arbitrary because there was some milestones in the negotiation process that that I used to create all these phases or period. In the first period, between the Doha agreement and the initiation of the formal negotiation in Doha, the parties met for 131 times, or 131 meetings took place with 45 distinct actors. And in the second phase, between September 12 and December 8, when the parties were able to finalize the rules, the agreement on rules and procedures on how to continue the Doha negotiation for the second phase. So there were 129 meetings in this particular phase, and 45 distinct actors were involved in that negotiation process. In the third phase, between December 9 and April 13, so this period ends with the Biden administration's announcement that they would like to review the Doha agreement. And in this phase, 257 meetings took place, and 61 distinct actors were involved in the negotiation process. It is in this phase that the US Secretary wrote to the Afghan president to expedite the negotiation process. And in his letter he talks about engaging the regional actors, the Taliban demand for principle for future constitution and inclusive government. The Afghan president, at that time, he rejected the proposal and came up with his own peace plan. And his peace plan had 3 specific steps or phases. And it talks about the political consensus and ceasefire as the precondition for the first phase, the presidential election, and the formation of the peace government based on that election, that is in the second phase. And in the third phase, the constitutional framework to resolve all conflict in Afghanistan. The plan was rejected by Taliban, no surprise about that. But the one interesting thing about this particular plan was that he even did not have enough support within all the faction within the Afghan government about this particular plan. And in the third, in the final phase is, April 14 to, you can say, but here we collected data until May 31st. That was, our end of data. But until the Taliban takeover, not a lot of meetings took place. But actually, most of the meetings, talking about the extension of the U.S. presence and then the troops withdrawal. I'll come to that point in a minute. So here we collected data on all actors involved in intra-Afghan negotiation process. And the figure shows that the number of peace process specific meetings and unique actors involvement over time. As you can see, parties were meeting for more and more meetings and more involvement of various actors in those meetings. And based on our methodology, altogether the parties met for 612 times. And that included 77 different actors, not only the Afghan side and the Taliban side, but also a lot of civil society actors and international actors. Actually, the meeting between Taliban and Afghan government, it happened only 23 times out of 612. And the Taliban had 67 meetings with third-party actors, including the United States. We also mapped, I don't know whether you can see this particular graph or not, we actually mapped out the network of all relevant actors in this particular peace process, and then trying to understand who is meeting with whom here. And the circle here is based on, the size of the circle is based on the involvement of, the frequency of involvement of in the particular actor in various meetings. And the red circle here represents the Taliban side, the maroon color represents the Afghan side, and the orange international actors, and light blue all the civil society actors. The key takeaway from this particular graph is how diverse the peace process is in terms of various actors, both international and domestic. And in a minute, I'll come about how divergent the issues are in this particular negotiation process. So we analyzed for the 4 different periods, we talked earlier, we analyzed the content of the meetings, and found 6 specific issues discussed in those meetings. So the women's issues, issues related to human rights, the Afghan economy, the ceasefire, the prisoners release, and troops withdrawal. In the 4th phase, or here, after the Biden administration's decision to review the Doha agreement, the troops withdrawal was the most frequently discussed issue. And we all know that the Taliban did not want that. They wanted the US troops to leave quickly. That was followed by the Afghan economy, the human rights situation, and ceasefire and women's rights. As the peace process, advanced, you can see that the women's rights were not getting a lot of attention, especially in the 4th phase of the negotiation process. How am I doing in terms of time here? Okay. So we also try to analyze the involvement of various actors and what kind of specific issues that they are talking, when they are meeting with each other. The Afghan government and Taliban mostly discussed issues related to ceasefire, troops withdrawal, and prisoners release. And of all the meetings that the Taliban had in the entire negotiation process, 612 distinct meetings, only 1 meeting mentioned women's rights or issues here. The Afghan civil society, they represent 17% of all meetings, and they were present in 44% of the meetings that mentioned women's issues or women's rights in those meetings. So women's issues were discussed mostly in meetings between the international actors and civil society actors, between international actors meeting international actors on Afghan peace process related issues, in meetings between Afghan government and international actors, and Afghan government meeting with the civil society actors. There was no, no mention of women's issue in meetings with the Taliban, except for 1 time. And while these all issues, are very relevant, like ceasefire, troops withdrawal, prisoners release, women's rights, human rights, and Afghan economy, the negotiation process never got into the substantive issues that was specific to the demand of the Taliban side. And these demands were specific to the role of religion, the Afghan constitution, and the inclusive government. They wanted Ghani to resign and pave the way for the inclusive government. But of course, we all know that Ghani did not do that. So there were a number of weaknesses in the intra-Afghan negotiation process here. The first, I would say that the Doha negotiation was a highly formal process. It was carried out by the team nominated by both sides, but the problem was that there was no visible engagement of the Taliban and Afghan leadership at the highest level. It was carried out by the team appointed by both sides. There was asymmetric preferences among divergent actors. For example, the Afghan and Taliban, as I said, they were mostly talking about ceasefire monitoring and troops withdrawal. And the third parties and civil society actors, they were talking about women's rights and human rights issue in Afghanistan. So you can see, the parties were not on the same page in terms of the issues that was relevant to the Afghan conflict. And the Afghan government lacked unified political front. As you can see in this particular, network, I have a few maroon color, circles here. And the reason, why is that because, there were, kind of factions, blocks, wanting to pursue different strategy in this particular negotiation process. So that means that the Afghan government did not have a consistent position when they were negotiating with the Taliban. The Taliban, they remained secluded. All the leaders were in foreign countries, and they were beyond reach to the civil society actors. This is very very much important in this negotiation. They were not available for civil society actors. And the Afghan civil society actors, they had a very good working relationship with the third-party actors in the United Nations, United States, Norway, and other countries. But the thing, is that these third-party actors never accompanied them when they were meeting with the Taliban. So they were not there with the third-party actors in those meetings. And the final point here, the regional actors, they had limited space and influence, but we all know that the Afghan conflict, has regional dynamics in terms of peace and security. What's going on in Afghanistan matters to countries like Iran, Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, China, and so on. So coming back to the issues related to women's rights, recently I published a paper with a colleague from Peace Research Institute Oslo, examining how the conflict termination relates to women's rights development in the post-conflict phase. And we found that in general, rebel victories are counterproductive to women's rights in the post-termination phase. And in that particular research, we found that it is the peace agreement, comprehensive peace agreement, and implementation of comprehensive peace agreement that contributes to the improvement in women's rights. So, but the thing in Afghanistan is obviously, it is a rebel victory. Taliban, won the war. And also the important thing is that, in Afghanistan is that this is not the first time that the women in Afghanistan are demanding for their rights. They had equal rights that was secured in the 1977 constitution in Afghanistan. Their rights, the rights in this was significantly curtailed when the Taliban came to power in 1996. And the Afghan, when they got their political and economic rights back in 2001, or you can say, it was institutionalized through the 2004 constitution. It guarantees equal rights. It guarantees 25% seat for women in the lower house, and 17% seat in the upper house. So the findings that we have, from our research and Taliban's own history in Afghanistan tells that the current situation in Afghanistan is not very suitable, or it poses a significant threat to women's rights in Afghanistan. So after the victory last August, Taliban, they tried to change the narratives, their image, or perception, among Afghan civilians and international community, that saying that that they are very inclusive. This time is going to be very different, and that's what I perceived in the first press conference that they had after their victory. They promised women's rights, they promised inclusive government with women's representation, but they did, we know that, up to now, they did everything opposite to that. The only, they formed only a male transitional government. There is no representation of women in the Afghan government as of now. The Afghan girls, they are not able to return to school. The Afghan, women, the working women, they are not able to return to their work. And there was a recent statement from the UNICEF suggesting that the child marriage is on the rise in Afghanistan, especially after the Taliban victory. So the only way, so I mean, the question for us, is then, is peace process relevant for Afghanistan in the context of the Taliban victory here? And I would say, it is also relevant to the question of women's rights in Afghanistan. And as I said, the only way forward for women's rights in context of armed conflict is, only after the comprehensive peace agreement and implementation of comprehensive peace agreement, there was a significant increase in women's rights. But the thing in Afghanistan, very strangely, you can see, 6 different instances of rebel victories. There was a rebel victory in 1973. And then there was a rebel victory in 1978 with the communist, winning the power. 1992, there was Mujahideen overthrowing the communist government. 96, Taliban overthrew the 96, government. There was 2001 anti-Taliban, coalition established a new government with the support from the United States and other countries. And in 2001, recently, there was, Taliban taking over power. So it's the cycle of rebel victories in Afghanistan. And, the only way to break this cycle of rebel victories is perhaps, through inclusive negotiation process. As I said, when I was talking about the earlier negotiation in Afghanistan, everything was very, it was not inclusive. All the key actors, were not part of the negotiation process in the 1990s, even after 2001. So if the Taliban are really serious about stability in Afghanistan, they have to negotiate with other political forces. That's what they promised, but they did not do that, and establish inclusive government. It is very key for the stability and peace in Afghanistan. So there are, evidence, from Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Comoros, that when the rebels, emerged victorious, the only way that provided stability, after the rebel victory was the negotiation with the other groups who were not part of the victory. So there was, inclusive peace process that stabilized the country after the war. So we have to understand that, but the thing is that the Taliban is not a homogeneous group. We have to understand that very clearly. There are various factions, even at the local level. And as of now, there is Haqqani network, which is more militant and more opposed to the women's rights in Afghanistan, are the dominant force right now. There are the Mullah Bardar's group, played a significant role during the Doha negotiation process, but they are in favor of the inclusive negotiation in Afghanistan, but they are not that forceful as of now. But we have to understand that the internal dynamics within Afghanistan, and then the external support that the Afghan Taliban needs to continue with the current situation is very different, right? So they need international support. They need support of local actors, the key political actors in Afghanistan, to continue to stabilize the country and for their own legitimacy. So that gives me some hope that in the future, It is just a matter of time. Maybe they are opening up the negotiation process, but we all have to wait and see at this phase. With that, I end my presentation here, and I invite you for your intervention. I don't know, how did I do in terms of time?
Right on time. I think that was great. Thanks. We can now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. Feel free to turn on your video function, but please keep yourself muted. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank all of its members and donors for their support. We rely on the contributions from people in our community to carry out our free international programming. If you want to make a donation or join ICFRC, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you very much. Maybe I can begin with a question while we're waiting for others via chat. Can you talk at all about the other regional neighbors that you mentioned earlier and their reaction to the Taliban victory and what role they might play?
One of the puzzles, that was not properly addressed in the whole intra-Afghan negotiation process is constructively engaging the regional actors in this case, right? The Pakistan, India, Iran, even Tajikistan and China and Russia. They obviously wanted to play a bigger role, and then, but for some reason, it did not happen. When I had interaction with the key policymakers, I always try to convince them the significance of the regional actors and how peace process was done elsewhere. Like, for example, in Central American countries, there was a series of negotiations between the Central American countries in early 1990s that led to the successful peace process in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and I tried to present that case. Look, this is the way to do the case of Afghanistan. Afghanistan conflict is not a conflict within Afghanistan, and it has regional dynamics. It did not happen, but after I was actually going through who has the political representation in Afghanistan as of today, and there are 12 countries who have a consulate service available in Afghanistan as of today. And it includes Iran, Pakistan, China, Russia. So you see, they are leaning toward recognizing, many of these countries have not come forward recognizing Taliban as a legitimate state or regime, but they are moving closer to that direction. And it looks like, there is an interest in, especially, for Pakistan to work very closely with Afghanistan, given what's going on in Pakistan itself.
Great, thanks. We have a question from a viewer. Are there any other peace agreements like Doha where the government in power was excluded from negotiations? Do you think future negotiations need to include groups like ISIS-K?
This is a very tough question. This is perhaps the only peace agreement. When I do research about civil wars, and we understand civil wars is between the government and then the challenger, the armed groups. And this is perhaps the only peace agreement in my recollection, examining peace agreements negotiated since 1945 up to now, is the only peace agreement where the third party state directly negotiating with the non-state actor, Taliban in this case. So it's unique. But in terms of whether it is relevant to include, the ISIS in the negotiation process, or not, but the challenge with ISIS is that it is not challenging the central authority of one particular state. It is challenging central authority of many states, right? So that's why it has international dimensions, and this is a unique case that I am not able to answer from my experience of working in peace processes. It's a very unique case. It is not, one dyad. It is like ISIS versus many other countries, including Mozambique, right? I mean, it's far away, right? So how do you bring all these countries together and then negotiate with ISIS? It's very challenging.
Okay, great. What can we as US citizens do to continue to advocate and push for women's rights in Afghanistan?
This is an interesting question, and it came, during the negotiation process. At one phase, I felt like all the international organizations working in Afghanistan on issues related to women's rights. I felt like these international organizations are not very sincere about the issues of women's rights in Afghanistan. They actually used Afghan women to promote, something very different than what they actually want. What Afghan women actually wanted was, participation in the negotiation process directly, so that they have more, influence in the outcome of that negotiation. So what we can do, from the United States is to make that, very clear that, obviously we want to support, the women's cause, but the way to do it actually giving them space, not taking their space in the negotiation process, and we have to be very careful about that.
Okay, great. So next question. It would seem that in the normal circumstance, the groups that are excluded from negotiations are the groups that are seen as bad actors. For example, the US just won't talk with certain parties, even if they are very influential. Can you say more about why in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban were included and the government was not?
So so let me give you a brief, overview of some of the findings from my other research. Like, we examined the comprehensive peace agreement and to what extent those peace agreements were implemented, and what is the impact of the peace agreement implementation on the groups that were part of the process and on the groups that were not part of the process, right? So finding was that, it decreases the conflict between the groups that were part of the process, but when the implementation was significantly higher, it also contributed to the decline of the groups, that were not part of the process. I would say it is trust building, because now the government is building trust that they can be trusted to implement the commitments that they have in the agreement, so that other groups, they don't have incentive to continue the fighting, right? They don't have enough public support or civilian support to continue the fighting if the government is delivering on those commitments. So now translating that findings in context of, Afghanistan, for example, here, obviously the United States, was being very strategic not to include Afghan government, because they were thinking that, they can coddle the Afghan government the way they want, right? I mean, they can bring the Afghan government into the Doha negotiation process, not the Doha agreement, which was secluded, but the thing was that in Afghanistan, the Afghan government, again, is not the unified actor. There were a lot of factions, and it was very difficult. They were in the position, saying that we need the support from the United States to continue negotiation with the Taliban. We would like to like this to be, between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but U.S. interest was not that, because we were so much concerned about the withdrawal of the US troops, and the only fastest way to do that is to engage with the Taliban, not with the Afghan government. I think that is the only explanation that I can find here, why we did that.
Great. Could you consider what the outcomes might have looked like had President Trump won the 2020 presidential election in the US?
It's a very tough question, Bill. But I think it would not be different. I think the troops withdrawal, U.S. troops withdrawal would have happened May 31st. So the crisis that we are seeing in Afghanistan, would be 3 months earlier than what happened after August 15, 2021. I don't see, given the Trump administration's position on what's going on in Afghanistan, I don't see any different outcome. So it's exactly the same in terms of all the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan.
One argument about why the US approach to Afghanistan failed is the lack of development of democratic institutions and economic development at the local level. Are there other comprehensive peace agreements that were more effective on this dimension?
This is, in our, this is, we are monitoring as part of our mandate. We are monitoring the implementation of the Colombian peace agreement that was negotiated with FARC in 2016. We have 30 analysts on the ground monitoring on a daily basis what's going on in terms of the implementation. So socioeconomic development aspect is the most challenging one to implement. And it is not only the case of Afghanistan, also in Nepal. I would say so I'm trying to understand what's going on in terms of state building aspects of peacemaking or peace negotiation, right? So from academic point of view, I am trying to see the tension between the comparative politics and international politics. So so the tension here is domestic political leaders, they are more interested to have a more control of domestic politics, which relates to what type of institution to build, where to deliver socioeconomic development and where not to deliver. But international politics at the state level, right? And when international politics gets into the domestic politics, then that's really challenging. And you are basically trying to influence the domestic politics, and that is what's going on in all the countries where, no matter whether the peace agreement was able to maintain peace or not, in terms of institution building, in terms of economic development, where you see a lot of international actors involvement, those dimensions were probably not adequately achieved. So I mean, we committed to do too much in Afghanistan, I would say, and the outcome is expected. So
maybe as a final question, I'll pose this, which is the United States went to war in Afghanistan in response to the terrorist attack of 9/11. Do you think that now that the Taliban has returned to power, that it will again be playing a role in promoting international terrorism elsewhere?
I mean, so even the US, national security cannot answer that question, right? So, so well, I have to, so it all depends on to what extent the Taliban are thinking about their legitimacy and survival in Afghanistan, right? So they know the US firepower. They know, how resolute the regional countries are, and how sensitive they are with issues about terrorism. So I think that I would like to give them in the kind of benefit of doubt that they don't want to do that. Is one of the stipulations in the Doha agreement is that they would not allow their members, other groups or cities or individuals to use Afghan soil against the United States and other countries, or especially the US allies. So I don't see that the Taliban are not committed, but it is just like whether the Taliban have the capacity to deter the growth of terrorism from Afghanistan and elsewhere. So it is the matter of that, and that's why it is important that the Taliban open up themselves, have inclusive dialogue with other political forces, include regional countries, and find very inclusive solution to the problems of terrorism and governance in Afghanistan.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We will conclude our program now. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Joshi for his wonderful presentation and for sharing his expertise with us today. I am honored to virtually present you with ICFRC's highly coveted mug for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. We will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. We are launching a new program series on December 16th, focusing on refugees and immigrants in Iowa. We will be sending you more information about these programs soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.